Hey folks, so this is a case I've actually covered before, around 5 years ago now, back when I could only find very limited information on it. But even with so little to go on, what that limited information painted was genuinely a strange picture at the time, and it's one that I think about every now and then. So I decided it was time to come back to it and see if I could have a more thorough look. The case is that of David Horesay and Frederick Hardisty, two experienced bushmen from the Northwest Territories in Canada. They were seasoned outdoorsmen, deeply familiar with the land, who for some reason seemingly walked out of a well-stocked cabin in June of 2005 and never came back. The place they disappeared within was the Nahanni National Park, or as many call it, the Nahanni Valley, located in the Decho region of the Northwest Territories, roughly 500 kilometres or around 310 miles west of Yellowknife. The valley has picked up a rather grim nickname over the years, the Valley of the Headless Men. By Royal Canadian Mounted Police count, at least 44 people have either passed away or disappeared in the region between approximately 1905 and 1969 alone. The scale of this wilderness area is vast. In 2009, the Canadian government expanded Nahanni National Park Reserve sixfold to cover 30,050 square kilometres, roughly 11,600 square miles, encompassing 91% of the greater Nahanni ecosystem. That expanded park is estimated to be home to around 500 grizzly bears, 2 heads of woodland caribou, as well as species of alpine sheep and goats. It contains the deepest river canyon system in Canada, extensive karst limestone landscapes with complex cave systems and sinkholes, and terrain that averages around 4,750 feet in elevation. This is a place where it could be incredibly difficult to find a missing person if you were to walk out there and have something go badly wrong. So, before we get into what happened to David and Frederick, I think it's worth briefly understanding a little bit about the place that they were in, because it really does add a layer of context to their story. I'll also add a link to the description of another video I made years ago where I went quite deep on the Nahanni National Park and everything that happened there. The Dene people have inhabited the Nahanni region for around 9,000 years, and they have long regarded certain parts of the valley with caution. Their oral traditions speak of a people called the Naha, a fierce mountain-dwelling tribe who would raid Dene settlements in the lowlands, and then would seemingly come to disappear without a trace themselves. It's not really clear what happened to them, but according to the stories, when the Dene people eventually gathered the courage to raid a Naha encampment in retaliation, they sent scouts through the Horseshoe Canyon near what's now called Prairie Creek, a secluded, nearly impossible to reach location, and found only smouldering fires and empty teepees. The Naha were gone, and the Dene people didn't know where or why. Some sources suggest the Naha may have eventually resurfaced in the southwestern United States, though that remains unconfirmed. The word Nahanni is actually believed to derive from a Dene term meaning river of the land of the Naha people. When outsiders really began disappearing, or worse in the valley, it started during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897 to 1898, when prospectors attempting an overland route from Edmonton tried to use the South Nahanni River as a shortcut to the Yukon gold fields. Many of them who entered simply never came out the other side. But the incident that really defined the valley's reputation came a few years later. The MacLeod brothers, Willie, Frank and Charlie, were Métis of mixed Indigenous and European descent, raised along the Liard River with deep knowledge of the trade routes, terrain and survival skills that northern travel demanded. Their father, Murdoch MacLeod, once served as chief factor at Fort Liard for the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1904, Willie and Frank brought cartridges and flour at Fort Simpson before canoeing up the Nahanni in search of gold. They came back with gold samples to prove that they'd found something. Willie and Frank went back in 1905, this time with a man known only as Weir, sometimes identified as Robert Weir, a Scottish engineer. That time, none of the three returned. In July of 1908, Charlie led a search party into the valley and located the remains of his brothers about 90 miles up the Nahanni, from its junction with the Liard River, nestled in spruce and poplar brush, and both were found headless. One of them appeared to have tried to spring out from his bedroll, though looks like he got caught mid-motion by whoever came for them. As for Weir, he was reportedly never found at all, though some accounts suggest that he may have turned up later in Vancouver or British Columbia, spending gold nuggets rather freely. I'll let you make of that what you will. The incidents continued in a recurring pattern. Prospectors would be found, often headless, frequently beside burned cabins throughout the following years. Again, if you want to know more, my linked video goes over a lot of the weirdness that happened there. That brings us to more recent times, though still around 21 years ago at this point. David Horesay was 60 years old and a lifelong resident of Fort Simpson, a small community of roughly 1,200 people situated on an island at the confluence of the Mackenzie and Liard rivers in the Northwest Territories. Fort Simpson's traditional name is Leadley Quay, which means the place where rivers come together. Frederick Hardisty, also around 60 years old, was from Fort Simpson as well. Those who knew them described them consistently as seasoned outdoorsmen. They were inseparable friends who, in the words of Fort Simpson community member Jonas Antoine, worked hard and spent a lot of time on the land. These were not people unfamiliar with the wilderness. They weren't weekend hikers or tourists, but really were the kind of men who knew how to handle themselves out there, and that is precisely what makes what happened to them difficult to explain. In early June of 2005, the two men travelled to a cabin belonging to their friend Rod Gunderson, located approximately 125 kilometres or around 77 miles northwest of Fort Simpson, near the North Nahanni River. The North Nahanni River itself is a major tributary of the Mackenzie River and flows through some of the most remote and impenetrable terrain in the territory. Their purpose there was to carry out some repair work on the cabin for Rod. Speaking of the cabin, when I made my video years ago, I wasn't able to find it as it's not exactly placed anywhere. However, I believe that I've been able to locate it using satellite imagery. A kayaking journal by a paddler who visited Rod Gunderson's cabin describes it as sitting about 30 miles up the North Nahanni from its mouth on a bluff overlooking the river with large rock cliffs directly behind it. Working upstream from where the North Nahanni meets the Mackenzie River, and cross-referencing with CBC News reporting that placed the cabin roughly 125 kilometres northwest of Fort Simpson, I identified a location that fits both references almost exactly. At this spot, there appears to be two small structures in a cleared area at the base of a cliff face, right on the riverbank, which matches the journal's description closely. Again, no official report ever published exact coordinates, so I want to be clear that this is my best estimate rather than a confirmed location, but I think it's a reasonable one. But either way, take this as an educated guess of the area and terrain that we're working with. Now, Rod saw both men alive and well at the cabin on the 12th of June 2005. That was the last time anyone would see them. When he returned to the cabin on the 16th of June, just 4 days later, he found the cabin door locked and both men were gone. Smoke was still rising from the chimney and small fires were visible nearby, suggesting that the men hadn't been absent for particularly long, perhaps only hours. Their firearms had been left behind alongside ample supplies of food and firewood. There was no note and nothing had been taken. It's not entirely clear what happened at this point, though we do know that he reported them missing that same day. I'd imagine that Rod must have waited around for a while, assuming that they'd be back soon, and when they didn't arrive, he made the call to the authorities. Constable Brad Parker of the Fort Simpson Royal Canadian Mounted Police aired the confusion that I mentioned earlier. He said, "Anybody that we've talked to has said there's really no reason why they left the security of the cabin. There are no apparent signs of any problems that we can see. They left the cabin without any firearms. They were stored at the cabin and were still there. There was plenty of food and shelter there, so nobody can seem to speculate as to why they left. Why would two experienced bushmen leave a well-stocked cabin and walk out into the wilderness without the means to protect themselves? It was June, so the cold wasn't the immediate threat it would be at other times of the year, although it certainly would have been overnight. And this is still remote subarctic terrain, and without supplies or means of defence, the risks were very real. The RCMP formally joined the search on the 18th of June, 2 days after Rod's report. Community members from Fort Simpson and the surrounding Dead Show communities had already begun combing through the bush by that point. A Department of Environment and Natural Resources employee deployed a thermal imager, and searchers worked the surrounding terrain on foot, by canoe and by helicopter. It was a significant effort given the serious remoteness of the location. This was a very difficult area to organise a search in, and to even get there in the first place. The RCMP terminated their official search after just 5 days, on the 23rd of June. Families and community volunteers refused to stop. They continued for close to a month, an effort that speaks to just how seriously the community took what happened and how unwilling people were to just accept that these men were gone without a trace and without a thorough explanation. The families of both men visited the remote site during the search, hoping for such an explanation as to what exactly happened. On the 27th of June 2005, 11 days after the men were first reported missing, volunteer searchers discovered David Horesay's body in a dense bush approximately 3.7 kilometres or around 2.3 miles from the cabin. The exact location was never publicly released, but if I'm correct about where the cabin sits, these areas on the map are my best guess. It seems unlikely that he'd have crossed the river to the east, and to the west he'd have to have ascended a mountain, so I've marked the most probable corridors. These are guesstimates though, so I do want to be clear about that. The area where his body was found had already been searched multiple times before they managed to find him. RCMP Corporal Al Shepard later explained that the bush was so thick that search teams must have simply missed the body on previous passes. Shepard said at the time, "It will give us a cause, and it will give us some closure to actually answer some of these questions that have been unanswered for the last 7 to 10 days. The body was then flown to Edmonton for analysis. Jonas Antoine, who was part of the search team and who knew both men personally, reported something of interest. David had unexplained burns on his hands and arms. The possibility that fire played some role in the men's fate was raised early on, with a CBC News report from the 24th of June headlined, "Fire may be clue to fate of missing Simpson men." Al Shepard stated the body was found intact and that foul play was not suspected. Search crews were now out in larger numbers looking for Frederick. Al Shepard told reporters, "We're still optimistic that we're going to find Mr. Hardisty." The search for Frederick continued. On the 5th of July, police brought in a tracking dog from Grande Prairie in Alberta, hoping the dog's scent tracking abilities might succeed where human searchers had failed. Then, on the 8th of July, Frederick's body was found floating in the North Nahanni River, roughly 20 kilometres or around 12 miles and a half from the cabin. Again, in an area that searchers had already covered multiple times, both by canoe and on foot along the shore. The fact that both bodies were located in terrain that had been searched repeatedly just speaks to how impenetrable the wilderness in that region truly is. Although, of course, in the river, it's likely that the body had been pushed around and may have been in different locations at different times. Antoine later recalled, "When we found Frederick in the river, it was kind of a relief. Finally, a lot of people can rest a little bit and get some sleep." But he also said there were still many questions about how two experienced woodsmen could have passed away in such a manner. After some analysis, the causes were revealed: hypothermia for David and passing away beneath the water for Frederick. The RCMP declared that foul play was not suspected and no further details were released to the public. Here's where things get a little bit difficult to ignore. Family members of both men have never accepted that the given conclusions explain everything, and their objections are specific. David's stepbrother, Joseph Horesay, who was actually a part of the search party itself, visited the cabin after the investigation and found a rather strange scene. He said, "There were shots all over the place, and there was a shot in the floor. The picture is bigger than just two guys who passed away accidentally. There was something else that happened before all of that came down." Frederick's brother, Robert Hardisty, found his brother's shirt with what he described as a big hole in it, as if a shot had gone through it. He said plainly, there's too much evidence that they didn't look at, and of course, there were those unexplained burns on David's hands and arms. It was never really explained what exactly was going on there. The thing that complicates everything when you take that into account is the fact that the autopsy results were conclusive. Aside from the burns, neither David nor Frederick had suffered from any physical injury, such that you might have expected to find in a foul play scenario. So, while the families found what they believed to be evidence of some kind of altercation or something at the cabin, the actual bodies showed no corresponding injuries. That does leave one to wonder just what in the world was going on there. Could the scene have been from an earlier time, or perhaps something else entirely was going on? It's not really clear. The family's complaints about the investigation itself were equally sharp. According to CBC, the RCMP never cordoned off the cabin, having decided early on that no foul play was involved. I have seen the complaint made that during the search, both RCMP officers and community volunteers camped near the cabin site, which of course meant potentially disturbing any evidence that might have been present there. When Joseph later asked the RCMP to investigate further in light of the physical evidence he had found, he was told that all evidence had been contaminated by the search party. I think you can understand why the family found that response somewhat unsatisfying. On the 12th of July 2005, the RCMP were in Fort Simpson to investigate how they handled the search for the two missing men. The Leadley-Quay First Nation and both families called for a public inquiry into the incident. A formal complaint was filed in 2005 regarding the RCMP's handling of the case. The RCMP conducted an internal review and cleared all of the involved officers, finding nothing wrong with the way that the case was investigated. I'm not passing blame or anything like that, but it is always humorous when you have a situation where it's like, we've investigated ourselves and found that we did nothing wrong. It's like, okay. David's sister, Rosemary Gill, put it simply in a 2018 interview with CBC News. How could two men in one weekend both pass away, one in the river and one in the bush? It's very unsettling. There's no closure. In May of 2018, Joseph travelled to RCMP headquarters in Yellowknife, bringing the men's coroner reports in hand and requesting that the case be reinvestigated. He was hoping the RCMP would reopen the case and bring some closure to both of the families. As of reporting at that time, the RCMP had not confirmed whether the case had been reopened. The official conclusion, hypothermia and passing away as a result of falling into the river, may well be accurate in the narrowest sense, in that it does physically describe what happened to cause each of them to pass away. But it doesn't answer the deeper question that sits underneath all of this. What on earth drove two experienced bushmen out of a safe, well-stocked heated cabin in the middle of the wilderness without their firearms? They can't have just decided to go off on a small hunting trip, or they'd have taken them. The simplest wilderness misadventure explanation doesn't hold up particularly well when you consider who these men were. These weren't people who didn't know the risks out there. And it also doesn't address the scene at the cabin as described by the family members, the hole in Frederick's shirt, or the burns on David's hands and arms. If those details of the state of the cabin are accurate, and as the families say they are, then it could be the case that something happened inside or around that cabin before those men seemingly went off into the wilderness. And what that something was has never been established. If an animal had gotten inside the cabin and caused a panic, there would probably be evidence of that in there. You'd probably expect to find fur and just some general signs of an animal going nuts in there. But that doesn't seem to check out. The cabin was also locked, so that doesn't really make any sense anyway. Perhaps David and Frederick could have been outside the cabin already working on it when an animal showed up and startled them. Although in that scenario, if they were right there outside the cabin doing their thing, again, I'm not really sure why the door would have been locked. There are some other considered possibilities too. The first and most obvious is foul play. If a stranger had been at that cabin with them, if there had been some kind of altercation or threat, it could explain why two capable men fled without taking anything with them. People in danger often run without thinking, without grabbing what they need, because they are focused entirely on getting away. If that's what happened here, it could also explain the physical evidence that the family members were concerned about. The counter-argument to this is that the RCMP found no evidence pointing in that direction, though of course the site hadn't been preserved as a potential crime scene, so it's difficult to know what might have been found had it have been treated as one from the outset. As for the unexplained burns to David, we know that he passed away as a result of hypothermia. Perhaps he could have tried to have started a small fire to warm up, but had an accident with it while out there in the wilderness. After all, hypothermia prevents fine muscle control after a certain stage, and your hands and fingers become very clumsy, and at a certain point practically become unusable. The second idea that gets raised is some kind of shared psychological episode, along the lines of what I'd describe as shared madness. If you've seen my video on the Tromp family, which I'll leave a link to in the description below, you'll know what I mean, as I go through that in some depth in that video. Though the general idea being that some kind of shared panic or delusion could cause two people to act completely irrationally and abandon safety. There are documented cases of this happening, and it's been seriously put forward as an explanation for other wilderness disappearances too. That said, it doesn't necessarily explain the physical evidence left inside the cabin that the family put forwards. Unless this shared madness caused them to feel like they were under attack or something like that, and then it might. I've seen some people bring up everything that's happened over the years in the Nahanni Valley itself, the long pattern of experienced people passing away in strange and unexplained ways. I don't personally think that a cursed valley, so to speak, is the explanation here, but I do think the geography and remoteness of the area genuinely contributes to these incidents in practical terms. The terrain is brutal, and the temperatures in that part of the world can plunge to around -50 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, and even in the summer, nighttime temperatures in the subarctic can drop sharply enough to cause hypothermia without protective clothing. It's worth remembering just how impenetrable this landscape truly is. The bush is so dense that a body 3.7 kilometers away from the cabin can apparently be missed on multiple search passes, which is exactly what seems to have happened here. I did need to come back to edit this part in, but I did find a little more information. Unfortunately, the links to the articles are down or no longer exist, just like a significant chunk of links from that era no longer work, sadly. However, the article noted that during the search around 4 kilometers downstream from the cabin, a single shoe and sock was found. The searchers also spotted wolf and bear tracks, though Brad Parker noted that David and Frederick's footprints indicated that they appeared to be taking a casual walk at the time and didn't appear to be fleeing from anything. In addition to the small fires near the cabin, another fire had apparently been started further downriver. Another piece of information that I came across states that David too had entered the water at some point and managed to get out. While some problems remain, it does allow us to speculate a little further. Could it be possible that for some reason that we don't understand, one of the two had fallen into the river accidentally and the other went in afterwards to try to get the first out? I wonder if Frederick fell in, was put in an immediate bad situation, and David went in after to try to help, but realised he could not. Then he managed to drag himself out and hypothermia quickly followed, which is why the shoe and sock were found, because he had begun to shed clothing. Perhaps while trying to make his way back to the cabin. I said earlier that hypothermia would be more likely to have occurred overnight as the temperatures dropped, but that was before I realised that David may have been in the water too. So it may be the case that they were never lost and were never stranded overnight, but rather an accident occurred and things quickly went bad. The fire downstream might have been David's attempt at trying to stay warm, but with Frederick in trouble he might have panicked and tried to get to the cabin to call for help, but sadly passed as a result of hypothermia on the way. Again, everything I just said is speculative, and the nature of Frederick entering the river in the first place is not understood. The RCMP mentioned seeing animal tracks, so it could be possible that they ran into something and were spooked by it, but that's not really clear. It's also not clear what this means in relation to the findings inside the cabin, where it was stated that there were shots all over the place. Perhaps they were from an earlier time and had nothing to do with David and Frederick. Though, with something apparently punching a hole through Frederick's shirt, I'm not sure. There may just be a piece of missing information that we don't know that would tie it all together. Ultimately, it's really not at all clear what happened that day to David and Frederick. As of today, the case doesn't seem to have an answer as to why they left the cabin in the first place. As far as I can tell, the case seems to be officially closed, and it is unlikely that there will be any future investigations without further evidence popping up. With that brings us to the end of this. Please do remember to subscribe and turn on notifications for the channel, and also to like the video and hype it if you can. I'd be very grateful. Or a dislike if you disliked it. I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a really big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. Be safe all, peace.